Welcome everyone to Ecology Live. I'm Jane Catford, a reader in ecology at King's College London and a senior editor for the BS Journal of Ecology. If this is your first time joining us at Ecology Live, then welcome. And if you're a regular to this series, then welcome back for this, our very final talk of the series for 2021. Thanks to our sponsors, Wildlife Acoustics, for the wonderful soundscape that you heard at the start of this session. I would also like to thank Oxford University Press, who have sponsored this whole series of 12 talks. You can find details of their Ecology Live reading list, which includes discounts and some free content on the slide at the end of the talk. As usual, the talk is being recorded and it will be added to YouTube afterwards. You can submit your questions via the Q&A box throughout the talk. There's no need to wait until the end, so just submit them as you think of them. And your questions can be either named or anonymous. It's up to you. You can also upvote any questions that you find particularly interesting by clicking on the thumbs up icon. I'm very excited to now introduce today's speaker, Jason Tylianakis, who's joining us from Christchurch in New Zealand. Jason is a professor in ecology at the University of Canterbury and a visiting professor at Imperial College London at Silwood Park in the UK. In his research, which I'm sure we're about to hear much more about, he examines how communities of interacting species respond to environmental changes, and he addresses these questions using a variety of study organisms and approaches. I'm delighted to now hand over to Jason.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'll just share my screen quickly. Can you see that? Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep.
So great, thanks. So yeah, thanks very much, Jane. Thank you all for showing up. I don't want to spoil this for anyone, but actually I can't see anyone. I'm standing in my living room by myself with my laptop on a ladder. The ladder is on a coffee table, and I can't see any of you, but wherever you are, I do appreciate you coming along tonight. I hope also you're staying safe and taking care of those around you. And even if you can't go out anywhere at the moment, you're more than welcome here in my living room. So come on in, make yourself comfortable. And I want to begin by casting our minds back a few years to the 7th of September 2008. Because that's when the US federal government placed Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae into conservatorship. Now, this move caused widespread panic because these two government-sponsored enterprises owned or guaranteed about half of the $12 trillion US mortgage market. So pretty much every Wall Street bank or home mortgage lender depended on them. Only a week later, fears of a liquidity crisis led Merrill Lynch to be sold to Bank of America, and the following day, Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, signaling the climax of the subprime mortgage crisis and a banking and financial crisis that would spread to Europe within 15 days and eventually plunge the entire world into economic recession. Now, borrowing and lending of money by banks, the flow of money is the lifeblood of pretty much any economy. And having lending relationships with a variety of actors helps banks to spread their risk. However, these relationships, these transfer of money relationships also provide a pathway for default cascades or other forms of financial contagion to spread. And as we saw in the global financial crisis, they can spread across the entire world. Yet, despite the importance of these connections, a bank's vulnerability to crisis also depends on its own characteristics, like, for example, its size and the extent of its leverage, as well as the creditworthiness of the individuals to whom it lends money, because, in fact, high-risk borrowers underpinned the entire subprime mortgage crisis. And on top of this, the economy as a whole is shaped by the surrounding context, like consumer confidence in certain types of investments or institutions. So we can't really understand how economies function and collapse by studying either the people who borrow money or the lenders, or even by studying both together and ignoring the connections among them. Now, this seems kind of obvious, yet sometimes as ecologists, we're often guilty of thinking that we can understand how ecosystems function and respond to environmental forces by only studying a single component of that ecosystem and its characteristics or traits, while ignoring all of the mutualistic and antagonistic interactions that allow the flow of energy and propagules, which are the lifeblood of ecosystems, as well as the traits of those interaction partners. Now, we know that interactions are more vulnerable than species because they don't just require the species to be there, they depend on the species behaving properly or having certain rewards or certain phenologies and overlap and so on. So we might expect that interactions are going to be more sensitive to environmental changes and show signs of being harmed even before species go extinct. So most importantly, though, these interactions provide a pathway through which species can influence each other. They are literally the influence of one species on another. So therefore, they are the pathway through which perturbations to the environment can spread. And when viewed in this way, essentially we have many of the same characteristics that allowed economic collapse to occur and cripple the global economy. And this begs the question, are we at risk of shocks propagating across the world's ecological networks and reducing their functioning? Now, I'm not sure if we really have an answer to that question yet, but answering it requires us to essentially know three things. First of all, do these complex networks of interactions relate to ecosystem functioning in any way, and if so, how? Secondly, which species or conditions drive the spread of perturbations across ecological networks? Is there any non-randomness to that we can begin to understand better how perturbations can spread? And lastly, we need to know how environmental drivers, these overall forces that shape how ecosystems work, how they drive those processes. Um, and and potentially alter ecosystem functioning or the chances of perturbation spreading, and whether we can see those spreads across the world. So those are questions that our group's been working on for a number of years, and I want to share some of that work with you. So we're going to look at how networks of interactions relate to ecosystem functioning, what drives the spread of perturbations across networks, and whether there are any environmental drivers, or how do environmental drivers impact these processes. And while talking about these, I'm hopefully going to convince you that species traits and interactions and ecosystem functions are actually tightly connected sides of the same coin, if you could have a three-sided coin, such that environmental changes have impacts that are non-random with respect to all of those components, the traits, the interactions, and ecosystem functioning. So starting off with the first question, how do networks influence ecosystem functioning? Well, we know from all of the biodiversity ecosystem functioning research that diversity of traits is really important in ecosystem. Traits determine how species contribute to ecosystem functioning, as well as how they respond to the environment, so-called response traits. And more recently, we're coming to understand better that traits can predict which species interact with each other. And in some cases, we can predict these interactions really well with even just a few traits, such as body size. As you can see here, the predator and prey body size are very good at predicting which interactions occur. Now, if the traits of two species are really well matched, like you can imagine this like a lock and key, then they're going to make the most effective interaction partners. So we could hypothesize that species with well-matched traits will prefer to interact with each other, and that those interactions will be the most efficient or effective at whatever that interaction is trying to achieve. Now, Guadalupe Peralta led a project to test these hypotheses using a 6-year plant pollinator data set. And what she found was when you had trait matching as well as phenological overlap, you got high frequency of interactions. So that means species were preferring to engage in interactions with good matching of traits and phenologies, and these interactions were also more constant through time, and that this led to improved pollination success, the impact of the pollinator on the plant. So this means that essentially the well-matched traits form both the stable or the most consistent and the most functionally important backbone of the network, whereas poorly matched interactions were variable in time, species just engaged in them opportunistically, and they had a lower overall pollination success. So trait matching doesn't just drive the formation of interactions, but it specifically generates the most stable and most functionally important backbone of the network. So already we're starting to see that species traits, interactions, and functioning are inextricably linked. And we can see this link even more strongly in the trade-off between species traits and interactions. This was some work led by Camille Cooks, and what we see here is an ordination of species in trait space. So each of these circles is a species of pollinator, and the distance between them, between any two circles, indicates that those species, or larger distance indicates that those species are more dissimilar from each other in terms of their traits. And the centroid here is like the multivariate average. So that's like if you were to grab any pollinator individual at random out of a network, those are the kind of traits you would expect it to have. And what we can see is that the species that are closest to the centroids, they have the most average traits, have a dark red color, which indicates a large number of interaction partners, whereas species that are far from the centroid, so species that have more unique traits, have fewer interaction partners, indicated by lighter colors. Now, if you think about functional trait space as the total functional diversity of a community, species on the edge of that trait space are essentially stretching it out. So they are the largest contributors to functional diversity. And that means those species that contribute the most to functional diversity have the fewest partners. And you could think of this as a trade-off between a plant might be trying to avoid competition at its own trophic level by becoming different, by moving into a vacant part of the niche space, by having different traits to everyone else, but eventually it could become so different that the pollinators don't even really recognize it as a flower anymore, and they stop visiting it. So there's a trade-off between having original traits but few interaction partners. So we could see this in a network as species with unique traits having few partners or low connectedness. So this essentially shows a relationship between species' functional role and their network role. Now, functional diversity, or having species with unique traits, is also important because it promotes niche complementarity. So going back to all of the decades of biodiversity ecosystem functioning work, we know that when we have species with different traits from each other, then they use different resources, they compete less with each other, and overall they function better. So diverse traits allow species to partition resources, but many ecosystem functions actually involve species interactions, and therefore the interaction partners themselves can be viewed as resources that can be partitioned. So the extent to which different species at one trophic level use different partners at another trophic level is a measure of their complementarity in partner use. And people like Tim Poisson and others have developed measures for this. So if we consider two networks like this, the top one has high complementarity because the species have very little, or in this case, no overlap in their use of partners with other species. In contrast, the bottom network has lower partner complementarity because species share more of their partners with each other, but it has higher redundancy because those species because if any species were to be lost, there are other partners that will potentially interact with its partners and potentially fill that role. So there's two things. If we look at these two networks, there's two things that it's important to note. The first is the connection between interaction complementarity and interaction specialization. So the bottom network has more generalists, and that creates overlap in partner use and reduces complementarity. The second thing to notice is that if you have high trait diversity, like in the top network, which is indicated by the different colors, we just seen before that species with very different traits have few interaction partners. That was the trade-off between trait originality and the number of partners. And we know that trait matching is important for determining interactions. So if we put this together, each of these species with very original traits will have high complementarity because it'll have interactions with other species with unique traits, and specialist interactions because those unique species have few partners. So in this sense, interaction complementarity can be directly related to trait or functional diversity at each trophic level. Now, it's not perfectly related because there is some nuance to that, which I don't have time to dwell on, but overall, we can expect some relationship between interaction complementarity and trait diversity. Now, if we were to think about the effects of niche complementarity on ecosystem functioning, we would expect that the top network with high complementarity would have would have the highest rates of functions relating to that interaction. In contrast, the lower network with higher redundancy will have less complementarity, potentially poorer function, but potentially more stability in that function because other species are there to fill that gap. And these hypotheses were again tested by Lupe Peralta in some of her PhD work, and she looked at parasitoid host networks and found that high network-wide complementarity in the use of hosts predicted a high total attack rate of parasitism of those hosts. And importantly, she found that network complementarity was a better predictor of parasitism rates than was either species richness or phylogenetic diversity as a surrogate for trait diversity. And then she also found that there was a tendency, although not, as you can see, not quite significant, a tendency for redundancy in host use or network redundancy to reduce spatial variability, so to have that stabilizing effect that we predicted. So from these examples, we know that networks of interactions can influence ecosystem functioning. So our next question is whether they also can propagate disturbance. But just to recap, trait matching and trait diversity relate to complementarity and partner use and can promote functioning. Interaction generalists can erode that complementarity because they create overlap and partner use, but they can promote redundancy. So we're seeing the importance of trait matching and also the impact of generalists on some of those processes. And we're going to see more of that as we go on. And lastly, we saw that generalists tend to have more average traits, so species with many partners are closer to the trait centroid, whereas specialists tend to be more original in their traits. So given these impacts on functioning, we know there's the potential for functional disruption caused by changes to ecological networks. How might those disturbances actually propagate? Now, we've known for quite a number of years that different habitats can differ in the interaction networks that they contain. So if we think about the propagation of disturbance spatially, we need to be thinking about landscapes like this where different habitats are next to each other, and therefore the extent to which perturbations can propagate will depend on the extent to which the networks in each of these habitats are connected up with each other and the extent to which they function in a way that's dynamically coupled. Now, some more of Lupe's work showed that edges of two habitats tend to be more connected than you would expect by just random mixing of species. So she looked at the edge of native and plantation forests and randomly sampled the networks from each habitat to create simulated edge webs, and then she found that the real webs were, in all cases, each of these bars here is a different web. In all cases, they were more connected, here shown with link density, than you would expect at random. So edges are highly connected, more than you'd expect at random, and this connectance emerges from a greater than random or an over-representation of generalists, interaction generalists at edges. So you've got generalists being selected at edges, creating connectivity among habitats, and these connections provide a pathway potentially for disturbance to spread. So then Carol Frost looked at this a little bit further in the same forest edges, and she wanted to say, well, if we've got these connections across habitats, is there the potential for dynamic coupling or indirect effects to move across habitats? So what she did was use parasitoid host networks from each of those habitats to construct one of these parasitoid overlap graphs. And on the blue side, we have the native forest. On the red side, we have plantation forest. And the links among species, this is among host species here, indicates the sharing of parasitoids. And the width of them indicates the frequency of that sharing, but that's not so important. So what you can see here is a lot of gray links, which indicate that species in one forest type shared parasitoids with species in another forest type. And there's so much of that sharing that there's the potential for indirect effects, that one species affects another, that affects another. So one host drives changes in parasitoid abundance, and that causes changes in attack rates on other host species, what we call apparent competition. So Carol caused an experimental change in host abundance in the plantation forest, and she used that and this network to predict the changes in attack rates you would expect on all hosts in the community based on all of those indirect effects. And she found not only that you could predict them quite well, but interestingly, the predictions within a habitat were no better than the predictions across habitats. So you could predict just as well how a host species abundance change would drive a change in parasitism on hosts in another habitat as you could within the same habitat, which basically means from the perspective of these organisms and these networks, the distinction between those habitats doesn't exist. They're functioning as a single dynamic unit. So not only does this mean that disturbances can propagate across habitats and potentially across landscapes, but they might do this in a way that we can potentially predict by having information about species interactions and in particular the sharing of enemies. So these indirect effects are able to propagate because mobile consumers can spill across habitat boundaries. This is some more of Carol's work at the same plantation native boundaries. And what she found was that that there was a net movement of consumers, of predators from the plantation forest, which had much higher productivity, into the native forest, which had lower productivity. So there was a net flow of consumers down productivity gradients, that essentially the productivity supported high herbivore abundance, which supported high predator abundance, and they spilled over into the neighboring habitat. And that this effect was stronger for generalist species, in this case, predatory wasps, than it was for the more specialized predators that she looked at, which were parasitoid wasps. So there's the potential for high productivity to drive movement, particularly of generalists, across habitats. And some work by Warwick Allen has shown similar things, but at a much smaller scale. So he looked at interactions among plants via shared herbivores in mesocosms. And he compared exotic and native plants and found that exotic species, by virtue of their high productivity, tended to have a high probability of interacting with herbivores. So exotic plants grew big and lush, and herbivores loved them, and you got high herbivore numbers. And what that meant was those exotic plants had a greater potential to exert apparent competition or indirect effects on native plants. And in some of his earlier work, he's shown that the indirect effects of exotics can actually benefit other exotic species more than they benefit other natives. So from the scale of individual neighboring plants right up to entire landscapes, differences in primary productivity or in growth rates of plants can drive the flow of consumers, particularly of generalists, and therefore the flow of indirect effects. And in keeping with this notion that generalists propagate cross-habitat indirect effects or cross-system indirect effects, this is some work from Talia Hackett and Alex Salve from Jane Mehmet's group, and they found that generalist insect species tended to connect habitats in a landscape meta network. So they went to both New Zealand and UK sites to landscapes. They sampled in all of the habitats in the landscape, looked at which species were found to connect up those landscapes, and it was generalist insect species as well as large-bodied pollinators. So putting this all together so far, we know that, or we've seen that interaction specialists promote complementarity and functional diversity because of their unique traits, while on average, while generalists tend to connect up landscapes and facilitate indirect effects. We've seen that interactions with well-matched traits are the most stable and function best. But then the last thing I want to talk about is how the environmental context affects the prevalence of these processes in networks, because what we're actually going to see is that it's non-random. It drives specific changes associated with these processes that are important for functioning and the spread of disturbance. So first of all, I think most ecologists are familiar with the idea that environmental changes cause or produce winners and losers. Some species do well, some species do poorly. And what we see, Becky Morris and I reviewed the literature on this, and I don't have time to go into many lengthy examples, but just a few examples from work in our group. We've seen that the species that win from environmental changes tend to be the generalists. We've seen that invasive species, the frugivores, tend to be more generalist. that among pollinators and plants and mycorrhizal fungi, the interactions among generalists tend to be the ones that persist the longest. And in this work with Romina Rader, we saw that large solitary and dietary specialist pollinators tended to be the first that were lost under agricultural intensification. So overall, loss of specialists, winning by generalists. And if specialists and their interactions are the first to be lost, then that's going to cause a faster than random decline in trait diversity because species with original traits are more likely to be specialists. And it's going to cause a decline in complementarity because remember, generalists break down complementarity. Specialists underpin it. So we're going to see, because of this non-random loss of specialists and gain of generalists, we're going to get faster than random decline in processes associated with ecosystem functioning. And we also see similar things to do with the processes around around network formation and trait matching. So the strength of niche matching, of niche processes, which are essentially trait matching or phylogenetic matching, versus just neutral abundance-driven processes that abundant species are more likely to bump into each other and interact. The relative weighting of those can be affected by environmental changes. So we've seen that warming and habitat modification can drive the strength of phylogenetic matching. And then this more recent work by Lupe and again by Camille, we found that you get a stronger signal of niche processes, so stronger trait matching between specialists and between native species than between exotic species or generalists. So here, as generalism increases among of two interaction partners, the amount of trait matching you see declines, and that decline is particularly strong for interactions among exotic species. So basically, if trait matching is declining, caused by any of these environmental drivers, then you're going to get a faster than random decline in interaction complementarity. And we've also seen that those well-matched traits are the functional and stable backbone of the network. So you're going to get a non-random reduction in consistency and functioning of networks. So to wrap this up and put it all together, we've seen that environmental changes can alter the assembly processes and the structure of interaction networks in non-random ways, even before the species go extinct. Now, selection against species with specialized interactions reduces interaction complementarity and functional diversity, as well as trait matching. So it reduces functionally important processes, while at the same time retaining those generalist species that connect up habitats and are the connectors across landscapes, and therefore the most able or best able to propagate disturbance. So we're seeing a shift. Environmental changes are changing the network playing field away from networks that are functioning well towards networks that are more likely to propagate crises. We've seen that indirect effects among species can spread easily across what we perceive to be habitat boundaries. So we need to start to abandon the idea of going to a habitat, sampling a network, and calling that an intact entity. And finally, putting all of this together, we've seen that species traits and interactions together link with ecosystem functioning and stability and dispersal processes to determine both functioning and the spread of perturbations across ecological networks and landscapes, and potentially even beyond. So I want to thank all of the many people who have been involved in this work. I've been very fortunate to have fantastic people in our lab group, and I didn't have nearly enough time to talk about all of their work, but if you're interested, check out our webpage. I'm grateful to all the collaborators involved in this work, the people that paid for it, to the BES for the invitation to come and speak. And lastly, I'm extremely grateful to all of you for turning up tonight. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jason. That was such a rich talk. I've written down so many notes for myself. Look at this paper, look at this paper. So thank you. I'm sure everyone's thoroughly enjoyed being in your living room this evening or this morning or in the afternoon, whatever time zone anyone's in. So a pile of questions are coming in. I'll try and keep my eye on it. So if any of you have questions, just keep submitting. I'll try and sort of navigate them so we can ask Jason some interesting questions, but I'll start with one from Charlotte Rakape. Species traits are considered as the mean species value. Thus, networks with generalists look less diverse. But could it be that trait diversity is intraspecific through plasticity and genetics rather than interspecific in those networks?
That's a really good question, and so the argument would be that generalists could be more plastic in their traits, and that's very possible. Particularly if you see that invasive species are generalist, and invasive species are often or can be plastic, and that can help them invade. Um, there's also another reason you might be right. That's more of a nuance of sampling, but when you have larger sample sizes, you're more likely to record interactions, so species will appear more generalist, and therefore you're also more likely to have a greater variety of traits just because you've sampled more individuals. So it's interesting. It's something that could be tested, but you would want to control for those differences in sample size. But it's a great point.
Katie Bickerton has one, and she said, brilliant talk. I think we'll agree with that.
Thanks,
Have you found overlap between areas of high complementarity and biodiversity hotspots?
Network complementarity, no. And we haven't looked for it, but I think given the potential relationship between network complementarity and trait diversity, I would suspect it would be likely. I think people have looked at specialization across latitudinal gradients, so that could be a place to start to answer that question, because if you have changes in specialization, then that can allow complementarity, and low latitudes tend to be biodiversity hotspots. So that could be a place to start looking for clues. But again, a great question.
Yeah, thanks. Lorenzo Maria Iozia has one, and it's interactions are less resistant than species, which is bad news. But is there also good news, thinking about the speed at which new interactions can spark?
Yeah, so yeah, it's good. Great to hear some good news. At the moment, it's few and far between. So yeah, there is the potential for new interactions to form, so-called rewiring. However, there are going to be some limits to that. So species have potentially a range of partners they could interact with, and then they will interact with a subset of them. There's some limitations to that range, like an elephant's unlikely to eat a mouse. But so there's going to be some limited range, and what Lupe's work showed was that they tend to focus on a narrower range of the possible partners, and they tend to focus on the ones that are the best fit in terms of traits. Now, if you're losing those interactions non-randomly, then you're forcing species out into those more facultative interactions, which still can work. Species probably still can make some kind of a living there, but they're functionally less important and less reliable or less consistent in time. So I think that there's some good news in the potential for rewiring, but there's probably some limits to that.
Yeah, and I guess all of those, their capacity to rewire also depends on other things that are going on, not just those interactions, but they're also being affected by environmental change, no doubt, as well, and loss of habitat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we've got one from George Ari Norega. Hi, Jason, great talk. I was wondering if the redundancy of the network in terms of functional trait diversity could affect the provision and stability of ecosystem services.
I would say yes, because all the other things being equal, the functional redundancy, like studies at single trophic levels have shown the value of functional redundancy. So I would say yes. Trying to think in terms of connection to network specifically. Well, if functional redundancy indicates species with more similar traits and are presumably closer to the average, then those will have more interactions and therefore will be more redundant probably in their interaction partners than more redundant than random. So I would suspect there's probably also a connection to network redundancy too.
Great. Well, maybe we'll just have a couple more questions if that's all right, Jason.
Yep, sure.
One from Camilla. Considering a scenario where exotic species increase interactions, would you say that is better to increase exotic individuals in the environment, even if it threatens native species?
I would say it depends on what your goals are. Yeah, unfortunately, most conservation goals are a subjective or point of view problem rather than necessarily a scientific one. And people do use, say, honeybees as pollinators, which are generalist pollinators, exotic in much of the world, to pollinate crops. And that's they do that. They do pollinate, but there's work like by Lucas Garibaldi and others that has shown that they're potentially not as effective, or that they could also benefit from having natives there. And the work from Lupe and Camille at the end showed that those that interactions among exotic species and among generalists tend to be those more facultatively occurring, less well-matched traits interactions, which function more poorly and are less consistent. So I think there's probably a cost to having those invasive interactions dominating things.
Great, thanks.
There's also the potential connecting up of the network and spread of propagation as well.
I'm two more questions, if that's all right, Jason. So thanks everyone for submitting questions. We might stop. It's always a temptation, isn't it, to ask lots of questions, but you can end up feeling a bit grilled. So I'll stop.
I don't have to go to bed for another couple of hours, so it's fine.
So now I've lost the question I was going to ask. Okay, so Marilla Gayasa.
Marilla, how's it going?
I see now. Okay. Hi, Jason. Awesome talk. What do we know about partner complementarity? What do we know about how partner complementarity relates to fitness? For example, plants that have more pollinators produce more seeds when compared to plants that are pollinated by a smaller number of species.
Yeah. So. Yes, so there can be complementarity in the functional traits of plants that visit so if you've got pollinators with different functional traits visiting a plant, that can increase pollination if those pollinators have different traits. On the other hand, so we didn't look specifically at complementarity in pollination networks, but others have, and I think there is still a relationship there, but that is at the entire community scale rather than the individual plant scale. So it could be that there's a trade-off between whole community-wide pollination being maximized by interaction complementarity, whereas individual species complementarity, individual species fitness being maximized by the number of partners it has.
Great, thanks. And then we'll just finish up on a question asked by Jess H. Lineages that have a more evolutionary stable past, fewer extinctions and or more diversification, have been suggested to be more central to species networks. Have you found anything similar in your work?
I've seen that, but I haven't looked at it myself. We haven't done a great deal of work with phylogenies and networks, more looking at whether phylogenies or co-phylogenies predict interactions, rather than location of individual species in a phylogeny and a network. So I can't add anything to that work that's already there. Thanks, Jess, and that might be Jess Hine, possibly.
Great, so thanks particularly obviously to Jason, but thanks to all of those of you who've asked questions and upvoted them. It was a really helpful way to sort them. There's really great questions that were coming in, but yeah, thank you so much, Jason. Such a great way to finish off this series of Ecology Live. So thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks, and thanks everyone for the questions. Bye-bye.
So that brings Ecology Live. Sorry, I have just lost my script. There we go. Thanks. That brings Ecology Live to a close. Thanks to Jason and all of you, as I've said, for joining us. If you've enjoyed Ecology Live, then why not find out more about what else the BES has to offer. As a member of the British Ecological Society, you can advance your science and your career with access to journals, member-only grants, and discounts to our events. We are a welcoming and inclusive home for everyone in ecology and a global community united by a passion for understanding nature and how it enriches our world and our lives. Visit the BES website via the link in the chat to find out more. Finally, I'll leave you with details of an offer from the sponsor of today's Ecology Live talk, Oxford University Press. You can use the discount code on this slide and in the chat to receive a 30% discount of their Ecology Live reading list, which includes this book shown here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for Ecology Live for 2021. Goodbye.